Hey everyone, welcome in, and we're going to pick right up where we left off in class, talking about partisanship, specifically the Dem-Rep and Federalist issue over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Both laws were passed by John Adams and the Federalist Congress, and both laws were highly contested by the Dem-Reps, because specifically the laws were meant to quiet the Dem-Reps and to sort of put them out, so to speak. While the Federalists were gaining power of the government. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, in response to the Alien and Sedition laws, worked with the Virginia and Kentucky state governments, and together they teamed up to write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These documents were effectively protests against the Alien and Sedition laws, and the logic that Jefferson and Madison utilized was based on the idea that the state governments were the functions that ultimately had to ratify the Constitution. People didn't ratify the Constitution. The state governments did, via the people, because the state governments were elected by the people. Madison and Jefferson argued for the Dem-Reps how ultimately, because the state governments ratified the Constitution, the state governments have the right to nullify any laws passed by the federal government. Nullify, by the way, means to cancel. So their argument was based a lot on the Constitution, which is interesting because, remember, Dem-Reps tended to be strict interpreters of the Constitution. So here's a wonderful example of how the Dem-Reps saw the Constitution as having to be taken very literal. And because the state governments approved the Constitution, Madison and Jefferson argued in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that the state governments had the power to nullify the law. Now, over time, the importance of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is going to be that it builds momentum for the Dem-Reps. A lot of Americans viewed Jefferson and Madison's fight against the Alien and Sedition Acts as a noble cause. People believed that what Jefferson and Madison stood for and what the Dem-Reps represented was a good change. So heading into the election of 1800, Adams would have to defend his presidency against Jefferson. But he would also have to take on some newcomers from the Dem-Reps as well. And really for Adams, I don't want to sort of carry out the idea that Adams's presidency was a complete disaster. Things didn't go very well, though. He was very caught up in the partisanship, the split between Federalists and Dem-Reps. And ultimately, Adams is going to lose the election of 1800. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions really sunk John Adams pretty badly. So he's going to lose the election. But where this thing gets sort of wonky and crazy is the fact that there was a tie in the election of 1800. Aaron Burr, who was a Dem-Rep from New York, who you may have heard of Aaron Burr actually, if you follow the Hamilton play and story. Aaron Burr is pretty important in Alexander Hamilton's personal history. But Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson tied at 73 votes apiece. What was supposed to happen is kind of crazy. Back then, the runner-up in the presidential election became the vice president. That's how Jefferson was actually John Adams' vice president in 1796. So what the Dem-Reps tried to do was rig the election in a way, or sort of take the election in a way that Jefferson would win the president and Aaron Burr would become the vice president. But they tied. So things got a little bit crazy. And because there was a tie, the vote to see who gets to become president goes to the House of Representatives. So in the House, the majority of the House were actually Federalist people. So the Federalists are like, man, what do we do to deserve this, right? We got to choose between two Dem-Reps. And the question for a lot of Federalists is sort of who's the lesser of two evils, Jefferson or Burr? Now, Burr was from New York. So Burr did have more support in the North than he did the South. And Jefferson, of course, represented Virginia, was heavily favored in the South. Ultimately, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson are going to engage in some real controversial sort of politicking. Like they sort of try to tarnish each other's reputations. They lean on favors. They're calling names. They're calling each other names. It got really nasty here. But, I mean, the presidency's on the line here. So, but ultimately, Burr and Jefferson go toe-to-toe here. But the end result is the fact that Burr is going to lose and Jefferson's going to win the presidency. And Jefferson will become our third president overall, but not without a little help from an unlikely friend. Alexander Hamilton, who had tremendous influence over the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton galvanized many Federalists to vote in support of Thomas Jefferson. Now, I know your head's probably spinning here. Don't worry. If my explanation's not good enough, tomorrow I've got a little Hamilton song that explains it all. So we're going to look at that tomorrow or listen to that in class tomorrow. The bottom line, though, for what you should be aware of about the story is that Burr and Hamilton didn't get along very well. I guess you could say Hamilton doesn't get along well with anybody, really, except for George Washington. But Hamilton didn't like Burr, and so he worked hard to get get Jefferson elected, and that Burr would not win the presidency. Now, because Burr lost, he still was the vice president. And this election is really important, actually, in terms of the president and vice president election, because 1800 was such a fiasco that ultimately the 12th Amendment was written to the Constitution. And the 12th Amendment deals with the protocol for electing president and vice president. We don't do the runner-up president, vice president system anymore. Imagine if that were the case. That would mean Hillary Clinton would have been Donald Trump's vice president, which would have been a little bit crazy. But see, that's how it used to be until this election. So the election of 1800 changed the protocol. Now, electoral college voters vote for president and vice president. So they cast separate votes. And it's always, since the election of 1800, been a system where we have it today, where you have a presidential candidate running alongside a vice presidential candidate. That changed with the craziness of the election of 1800. But what doesn't change is the partisanship. Partisanship would remain a central issue, and we are now at the point where we're moving into the 19th century. And what I'll tell you is about Jefferson's election. It's the last thing I want to bring up. And of course, as usual, we'll recap these tomorrow. What I want to tell you about Jefferson's election is that sometimes it's referred to as America's sort of bloodless revolution. There was a change in political power. This is so important. There was a change in political power from one group to the next. Throughout the course of human history, many times groups have tried to change political power, and it almost always resulted in violence and bloodshed. In this case, in America, the Constitution, although it was flawed, proved that there could be a transfer of power from one group to the next without there being bloodshed. Jefferson's Revolution of 1800 was a stunning accomplishment in a short period of time for a new government. To demonstrate the ability to go from one party to the next without war is a precedence that is set in American history throughout all time. And Jefferson's victory, although not popular with the Federalist Party, is going to now create a run where the Dem-Reps are going to dominate, and I mean dominate politics for the next 24, 25 years. So get used to a lot of Dem-Reps winning presidential elections, and get used to the idea that partisanship, although the Dem-Reps would have a strong foothold, partisanship is not going away in American history. I expect questions tomorrow. I expect you guys will do a great job with this tomorrow. In the meantime, I just want to remind you, let's have a great finish to class tomorrow. We've got the break, I know, but let's hit things on a high note before we head off to the vacations, wherever you guys are going. I'll end today as reminding you, as always, the past shapes the future. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful Monday.